Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is the Vulgar Marxist. It has required a sick day for me to get back to recording any videos, which should tell you the exact hell that Christmas is for truck driving. That said, it is with no small amount of irritation that I begin this video. The person I intended to assist with this video, BadMouse, has, realizing that he summarily lost multiple debates, fled shrieking into the recesses of the internet to not be seen. I have no clue how long. He says a year. I'm not certain we'll ever see him again. However, the jaw-dropping loss of his debate with Sargon of Akkad cannot simply be ignored. Too many critical points were glossed over. Too many arguments that should have been made were not made. Too many premises central to the work we are doing were simply ignored entirely. The entire thing ought to be redone, but frankly, I can't get Sargon to agree to it, so I'm afraid I will have to adopt a slightly different format from the original. Because I cannot get anyone to debate with me, I am going to have to effectually field the questions solo, and because of the sheer breadth of the topics being discussed, I will likely have to do one video on each of them. Therefore, this video is going to be an in-depth discussion of the first question, which in a few seconds we will have repeated for us, after which I will go into the topic and cover it as thoroughly as I am able.
So the first question is, are markets efficient and sustainable?
I would like to point out at this juncture that those are two entirely separate questions. Because of certain exigencies of marketing, it is entirely possible to have an economically efficient system that is completely unsustainable ecologically, and an ecologically sustainable system that is by no conceivable stretch of the imagination efficient. If we had only a few thousand people living on the planet, we could quite easily sustain a jaw-droppingly inefficient system. But we could not sustain even the most efficient system were we to have, say, 30 billion people trying to live upon the earth. Marketing comes into this because the propensity to tell people they need significantly more than they do tends to result in wide-scale overconsumption, but that's a later video, I suppose. Now, while I do have the penchant for being highly critical of people when they make grotesque and horrifying errors in structure, I am entirely happy to congratulate people when they manage to get something right. Therefore, for the intro to this answer, I am actually going to go to someone else who I've previously criticized. Menxi, take it away.
So in order to uphold this vision of capitalism as, super efficient and only there to serve the consumer, you have to make some assumptions about perfect competition. So number one, every firm is alike. So in essence, there's only one firm. Or there's, a million firms, but they all have different names, but they're essentially alike, so there's really just one firm. Every firm is very, very small in relation to the market. So every firm is just infinitesimally small, so much so that they do not believe that they will have any impact on the market, basically no matter what they do. And this is done to abstract from the idea of demand. So they are basically demand indifferent, and that they think that they can just produce whatever, and it's not going to actually have any influence on the market because they believe this will not happen because they are too small. Every firm is a price taker, not a price setter. So they do not set prices. The market just decides. The market gives them the price, right? Nobody is setting prices. And as a price taker, it seeks to maximize its own satisfaction, which is its own profit.
So if I go in and I observe firms setting prices, I'll say, aha, imperfect competition. If I observe firms take into account other firms, I'll say imperfect competition. In fact, if I observe any firms at all, I will always end up saying imperfect competition because the construction is so bizarre that it does not survive any observation.
Thank you, Menxi. That was phenomenal. I'm not completely certain where you're getting demand indifference from, but whatever, we can deal with it. In any event, I am going in this video to drill down on two concepts Menxi didn't express. She's been very helpful, but we're going to go a little bit beyond this. The first of them is coercion. the free entry and exit of the market, and the second one is perfect information. Now, these are the two things that really undermine the existence of markets in the real world. One of the reasons I absolutely despise free market theories is they're entirely based on principle. Sargon himself later in the video, well, not mine, later in his video flatly admits there is no observable existence of a free market in the real world. No other science would be allowed to do this. If physicists were to assert the existence of a particle and provide no data proving its existence, they'd be laughed out of the room. If chemists were to assert the existence of a reaction between two elements and provide no data on that reaction occurring, and every experiment combining those two elements repeatedly failed to produce the reaction, they would be declared a failure. They would not be allowed to publish those results. Yet the entire basis of economics is the wildest speculation and supposition with no empirical evidence to support their claims in any form or kind whatsoever at all. Now, before we proceed, we need to have a very basic understanding of what we're talking about when we say efficiency. What is meant by efficiency? Efficiency is functionally guaranteeing the maximum utility to the maximum number of people. It is supposed that as suppliers produce commodities, the market will set a price for them by matching the amount supplied to the volume people wish to have, i.e. the demand. Where these two lines intersect creates a price point at a specific volume of commodity, and that price point is assumed to be efficient given that all of the people involved are acting freely. That is, people who don't like the price are free to stop buying, thereby lowering demand. Suppliers who may suddenly realize, hey, I can make a ton of money doing this, are free to increase the supply. Conversely, suppliers who are not making any money doing this are free to stop supplying. Consumers who suddenly realize it's too expensive to buy this thing suddenly stop. Consumers who say, hey, that's a really awesome price, I'm going to go out and get that, go out and get it. This is where her concept of demand indifference doesn't make very much sense in the context of a free market. By definition, actors have to be free to move in and out of the market almost at whim in order for prices to be set at all. So if people demanding goods and services are not free to enter and leave, demand is always constant, and there's no way to correct if suppliers decide to simply engage in monopoly behavior. Now, obviously, I'm not saying suppliers don't engage in monopoly behavior. They very obviously do, but within the context of the principle, it is demand that should correct monopolies out of existence. Now, anyone looking at this graph will very quickly notice that it has no numbers on it. The reason for this is that the equilibrium point can theoretically be anywhere. It doesn't have to be where it is. It could be up top, it could be the left, the right, the bottom. It isn't one fixed position. This in turn creates what is functionally circular reasoning, whereby whatever price the market has set must be assumed to be equilibrium because the market is setting it. Therefore, even if we have wide-scale robbery, swindle, and fraud, we'll get into information asymmetry later, that must be assumed to be the most efficient price merely because it's the price that happens to be set right now. Now, we've already addressed that in order for this efficient price to be achieved, actors must be free to enter and leave the market at whim. That is, those who do not feel the price is good must be free to stop buying or selling, and those who do feel the price is good must be free to start. Now, I have in a previous video addressed part of the problem with this, and I'm going to replay that here.
Suppose now the worker were to refuse to yield to the coercion of any employer, but were to choose instead to remain under the legal duty to abstain from the use of any of the money which anyone owns. He must eat. While there is no law against eating in the abstract, there is a law which forbids him to eat any of the food which actually exists in the community. The law is the law of property. It can be lifted by any specific food at the discretion of its owners, but if the owners unanimously refuse to lift the prohibition, the non-owner will starve unless he can himself produce food. And there is every likelihood that the owners will be unanimous in refusing if he has no money. There is no law to compel them to part with their food for nothing. Unless then the non-owner can produce his own food, the law compels him to starve if he has no wages, and compels him to go without wages unless he obeys the behest of some employer. It is the law that coerces him into wage work under the penalty of starvation, unless he can produce food. Can he? Here again, there is no law to prevent the production of food in the abstract. But in every settled country where there is law which forbade him to cultivate any particular piece of ground unless he happens to be the owner. This again is the law of property. And this again will not be likely to be lifted unless he already has money. That way of escape from the law-made dilemma of starvation or obedience is closed to him. It may seem that one way to escape has been overlooked, the acquisition of money in some other way than by wage work. Can he not make money by selling goods? But here again, things cannot be produced in quantity sufficient to keep him alive, except with the use of elaborate mechanical equipment. To use any such equipment would be unlawful, except on the owner's terms. Those terms usually would include an implied abandonment of any claim of title to the products. In short, if he not be a property owner, the law which forbade him to produce with any of the existing equipment and the law which forbade him to eat any of the existing food will only be lifted in case he works for an employer. It is the law of property which coerces people into working for factory owners.
I am so incredibly grateful to Mr. Hale for making that article, and I earnestly encourage everyone to read the full length of it. It is precisely by the act of coercing workers under threat of starvation and hypothermia to continue selling product regardless of changes to price that the market is able to continue existing at all. And again, this is no idle speculation. There are clear historical records showing this phenomenon. Wheat prices prior to the Great Depression would be an extremely simple example. Farmers growing wheat received a bountiful harvest for several years. Unfortunately, because the bounty of the harvest was so great, the price fell. The market for wheat collapsed. However, because the farmers were locked to their land and couldn't very well just pull up stakes and leave without taking a huge loss, they were forced to continue planting wheat year after year, even though the robust harvest caused wheat prices to fall lower and lower each and every year. And to those of you wondering what the heck this has to do with market efficiency, right now in the United States, 40% of the food produced goes into the garbage, most of it before being prepared. And no, it's not milk, it's not dairy, it's not meat. Most of it is cereals, vegetables. The package was damaged. One of the tomatoes in the package has a bruise on it. The head of lettuce has a brown spot the size of a quarter. One of the apples was rotted, so the entire package of a dozen is thrown in the garbage. I deliver to grocery stores. The dumpsters behind them are ridiculous. It really is a ghastly and appalling travesty. The amount of perfectly edible food that gets thrown in the trash because one jar of jam broke and every single thing under that jar of jam in a stack of boxes 6 feet high gets thrown away because they can't sell it because it's got jam all over it. And if for a second you seriously believe that throwing 60 million tons of food into the trash is environmentally sustainable, we need to have a conversation about how plants work. In order for a plant to grow out of the ground, and I can't believe I have to explain this to people, it needs to consume nutrients in the soil. Yes, it does get nutrients from the light of the sun, but a huge portion of the nutrients come from the soil in which the plant is grown. So functionally, when food is thrown in the trash, what we are doing is transferring 60 million tons of nutrients from farm fields to landfills. Let me repeat that again because I want to make sure you understand what I just said. When food is thrown in the garbage, the nutrients the plant consumed to produce the food, whatever thing you're throwing away, the tomato, the head of lettuce, the apple, whatever, is no longer available in the soil of the farm field. It is now locked in whatever landfill you threw it into. And this is usually buried several hundred feet under piles of otherwise useless plastic. So it's next to impossible to reclaim those nutrients. This is why we have a multi-billion-dollar industry in fertilizers, an industry that might be completely and totally unnecessary if we simply took the waste food and returned it to the farm fields. So again, how is it efficient to take 60 million tons of nutrients and instead of putting them back in the farm fields where we got them out of, put them in a landfill and then fund a multi-billion-dollar fertilizer industry to put nutrients into the farm fields instead of the nutrients we took out? That's not efficient. That's not sustainable. I don't get how this could possibly confuse anyone, but maybe it's a one-off. Let's look at some other things. I don't know. Let's look at homes. Immediately following the 2008 financial collapse, one of the things the banks did was hold homes off the market, a very large number of homes, by the way. I've seen quotes as high as 15 million. That was immediately after the market. This article is from later, a few years later, and we still have 7 million homes held off the market. And this was done in order to inflate prices. That is, in order to ensure the banks could profitably finance new home construction, the existing stock of homes was artificially constricted in order to boost the price of the homes for sale and ensure that bankers could charge interest on both the homes and the construction of the homes. And it's not as if we're going to suddenly have this massive demand for more homes. Anyone passingly familiar with U.S. population rates understands the only reason the U.S. population is getting larger is immigration. And this is instantly one of the reasons I love to laugh at neo-Nazis and the white people first idiots, because hilariously enough, this is happening to every single demographic, but that's an aside. This is the market very clearly signaling that more houses are not needed. Okay, and yes, they did build fewer houses, but you're still seeing 3 million houses constructed at a point in time when we already have 7 million too many houses. And yes, I'm aware the construction industry would take a hit. I deliver to Menards. I deliver to Home Depot every single week. Every single month, at least, I'm hauling nails, boards, plywood into some distribution center somewhere. Yeah, I understand. It would take a hit. But that is not the question currently under debate. The question currently under debate, I remind you, is, are markets efficient and sustainable? And we can plainly see right here, how is this sufficient? The market is very clearly signaling it doesn't need any new houses. Interest rates are falling, and yet home production and home prices are going up. Why? So bankers can sell more homes. But let's expand this discussion one more time. Now, I'd like to do an aside here quickly. I really, really deeply wish I had data on the number of vacant and unused factories, the number of vacant and unused warehouses, the number of vacant and unused shopping malls. I drive past them every week, deliver to factories and warehouses and shopping malls right across from them. I'll drive up a row, a business park, past dozens of empty buildings to the one single remaining operational warehouse in the entire place. I know the numbers must be staggering, particularly in terms of square footage. Buildings alone would be jaw-dropping, but square footage would be ridiculous. If for no other reason than knowing would we be capable of seizing vacant and unused capacity and staging a revolution entirely without seizing any currently operating means of production. That question alone would be worth the effort of tabulating the available space in industrial and commercial capacity that is not used. But let's proceed. One last query before we move on. Now, before we proceed, we need to understand the concept of component costs. The sale price of a commodity must cover all of the costs incurred in producing the commodity, or the sale would not occur. Therefore, if one component of a commodity is mispriced, everything using that commodity must also be mispriced, because the sale price of the secondary commodities must reflect the mispricing of the primary commodity. So, in this example, if, for instance, energy is grotesquely mispriced, then absolutely every single other thing in the market must be mispriced, because every single thing in the market has energy as a component. Now, why would I hold that this graph and this graph alone demonstrates that energy must be mispriced? Surely this would be obvious. We are throwing away, allowing to float away into the sky, 2/3 of our post-production energy. How can that possibly be efficient? And even if we blanketly assume that's magically efficient for whatever the hell reason, how can that possibly be sustainable? In what possible universe can allowing 2/3 of our post-production energy to simply be ecologically or economically sustainable? I mean, by definition, for that to be occurring, the price of energy must be 3 times its correct price. It would have to be. The component costs must be included in the final sale price. If we are digging 3 times as much coal out of the ground as we need, this additional production must be covered in the final sale price of the coal. If we are drilling 3 times the oil we need, this additional production must be covered in the final sale price of the gasoline. If we are setting up 3 times the number of wind turbines or solar panels that we need, this additional cost must be covered in the final sale price of the electricity. That's simply how that works. And I'm going to get into what this means later. This means something beyond merely what I'm saying right now, but we're not going to cover that right now. Right now, what we are covering is by definition, the sale price of energy must be 3 times the optimally efficient price, even if we hold that some loss due to thermodynamics must be occurring. We're still looking at double the correct price. Okay? Maybe 150% of the correct price. But whatever the price is supposed to be, this cannot be this. This cannot be the correct price. And I cannot conceptualize an argument under which, again, allowing 60 to 70% of our post-production energy to simply float away could possibly be sustainable on the long term. That is a ridiculous proposition. Now, before I close this video out, it is necessary to cover 1 or 2 more concepts. I promised I'd do them, but this video is rapidly approaching half an hour. The first of these is called information asymmetry. In more layman's terms, lying. The recent example of Star Wars Battlefront 2 is the simplest I can get people to understand. It is painfully obvious that from the beginning, EA Games clearly understood what they were doing, clearly understood that the product they were selling contained features that their consumers would in no way appreciate being included, and proceeded to omit any mention of these features in any of their advertising or sales promotions in order to increase their sales. The backlash to this is, well, on your screen. However, we must keep in mind that this feature has been a component of markets for as long as there have been markets. Quid emptor, I don't even know how long that phrase goes back. Certainly to Italy, ancient Italy, possibly to the Roman Empire. But it is clearly understood through centuries of transaction that the person selling a product is going to know more about that than the person buying the product. And that any negative consequences for purchasing a product that was unsatisfactory or even openly harmful to the purchaser inevitably fell on the purchaser up until very, very recently. I think it's only in the past few decades we've moved away from this construct. Closely linked to this is the concept of negative externalities. That is, that the consequences of things such as pollution, poor safety practices, etc., should be imposed on actors other than the ones who benefit from imposing those consequences. A simple example is pollution, where an actor who adopts inadequate safety practices or inadequate pollution controls, water being a simple example, enjoys the financial benefits of those inadequate controls, while the consequences of those inadequate controls are imposed on the surrounding community. Another example is Flint, Michigan, where the city saved money by not bothering to replace the lead pipes, while the citizens of the city were forced to bear the burden of the health effects of the lead in their water. How all of this relates to market efficiency would be, I would hope, patiently obvious by misinforming customers as to the capacities of their product. Sellers are allowed to raise prices, charging 2, 3, 4 times what the product is actually worth. Conversely, by imposing the cost of their production onto persons other than themselves, they're allowed to lower their component costs, thus increasing their profit margin and their profits. These two things generally work in concert because a seller may impose externalities vis-a-vis the mechanic of the product itself, say a toaster oven that frequently catches fire because the insulation is not adequate, and then lie to their customer about the adequacy of the insulation and the likelihood of the toaster catching fire. However, There is one further component here that I have not as yet addressed, and I assured you I would address it before, and I would like to go into that now.
This tax, often referred to as the HIT or HIT tax, the HIT tax, imposes fees on health insurance coverage to consumers. It's a pretty simple business concept that this HIT tax results in. That if a fee increases on an insurance policy, if a fee goes up, there's a fee charged to the company that issues this insurance policy, then that fee gets passed on to the consumer. It's the consumer then that pays the fee in the form of higher health insurance costs. As is the case with most excise taxes, whether it's an excise tax on food or beverage or any other item, personal good, if this tax takes effect, this health insurance tax takes effect, costs will be passed on to consumers directly in the form of higher premiums as confirmed by the Congressional Budget Office.
I would like to thank Senator Gardner for being so forward and blunt. Now, I need to explain what I mean by that. We have already discussed the fact that the component costs of a product must be included in its price, and this would necessarily include all taxes imposed on the producer. However, that's not what Mr. Gardner has just said. What Mr. Gardner has just said is that the tax will be passed on to the consumer directly. That is, if the cost of a product was $2 and it was selling for $3, and a $1 tax was imposed on the producer, then the cost would necessarily increase by $1 from $3 to $4. That's not what happens. That's not anything that happens. In fact, this is very interesting because this gets us back to Minksie's proposal of demand indifference. Because in order for that to happen, producers would have to be demand indifferent. Let me explain. Let us suppose that a tax was imposed, increasing the price of a product from $3 to $4. Now, the cost is $2, and the new cost is $3, of course. However, if we observe the graph here, because the cost of the product has increased to the consumer, that is, it was $3, it is now $4, consumers are that much less interested in purchasing the product. Consumers who previously could afford the product at $3 can no longer afford it at $4, and even consumers who can afford it at $4 may no longer be interested in purchasing the product at $4. I'm happy to buy a pound of chicken for $3 a pound, but I'm certainly not paying $4 for chicken. That's preposterous. Therefore, the demand for the product as the price goes up would necessarily fall. That's 101 level economics. The higher price goes, the lower demand goes. So, when the demand falls, however, the price would necessarily also fall as lower demand results in a lower price. Now, in our example, the price would go to $4 initially, but the falling demand would reduce the price back down to, say, $3.50 or even $3. It might possibly go as low as $2.50. There is no reason to believe, however, as Mr. Gardner claims, that the entirety of the increase would be passed along to consumers. That doesn't make any sense. And the fact that Mr. Gardner is asserting this tells us that not only do conservatives recognize that markets are not setting prices efficiently, they're relying on it. They're implicitly counting on markets not to correct as prices increase. I mean, he says it himself. It's basic economics. It's basic economics that prices will not correct efficiently as demand changes in relation to price changes. It's a very interesting assertion there. But from this, we reach our final conclusion. It is recognized by one and all that markets do not set prices efficiently. Socialists recognize this. Conservatives recognize this. Economists of both stripes recognize this. They may deny it. They may lie through their teeth and sing a merry tune to pretend it is not the case, but at the end of the day, if you actually sit down and go point by point through what would have to happen for markets to set prices efficiently, they will happily admit that none of those things are happening, nor do they want any of those things to happen. Conservatives are perfectly fine with costs being passed along to consumers directly. They have sought at every turn and point to remove protections against negative externalities and companies blatantly lying to consumers about what their product does or how much it's worth or anything that happens to be going on that may make it less than desirable. Liberals are more circumspect, but they still will very happily deny that any of these things are actually occurring or actually affect prices or anything else, as long as it's convened to the narrative of neoliberal economics being the be-all and end-all of everything we need to understand. So there really is no reason to believe that markets are efficient, or even if they were efficient, are sustainable in the long term, ecologically or within the internal consistencies of their own structure. As the gentleman at the start said, if I see any firms at all, I am forced to conclude that markets are not efficient. Heck, if I see any actors at all, I am forced to conclude that markets are not efficient, because inevitably it is not in the interest of actors to be completely forward and honest about the product they're selling. There is no way for markets to function efficiently. It is logically impossible within the own tautology of the markets themselves. This is one of the reasons that economics as a science makes me absolutely crazy. As I said at the start, no one would be allowed to get away with this in physics or chemistry. But because economics is, for all practical purposes, a religion, they are allowed to do this again and again, and no one calls them out on it. That said, a quick channel note before I go. Once again, it has taken me nearly 3 weeks to get this video done because I could work on it only incrementally. I literally did this video 5 minutes at a shot because it would be 2 in the morning. I'd have an hour before I went to bed, and I just had to do it part by part by part by part. That's why it's so incredibly choppy. It's probably going to be January, and I'm very likely going to need to find a different company to work for before I'm able to begin producing videos seriously again. I would deeply love this channel to grow. I really, really would like to do a video a week, but at the present time, that is simply impossible. With that, I wish you all the best of evenings, and hopefully we'll be able to get another video out sometime in the reasonably near future. Good night.